Hello, this is the fifth in this series about Mennonite history. It's called An Uneasy Golden Age. And it's a talk by me, Elma Schemenauer. I'm an author of a number of books. I was born into a Mennonite family, grew up in a Mennonite community. I was born on the Saskatchewan Prairie, so I sometimes call myself Elma Mary from the Prairie. I was born Elma Mary Martins, and there's my website. In the 1870s, the Russian government broke some of its promises regarding Mennonite freedom. One example, Mennonite schools had been teaching in German only. The Mennonites had brought the German language with them from Prussia, and they had been brought into Russia, actually invited into Russia because they were German speaking, along with German speaking Catholics and Lutherans and other groups. So that was something quite important to them. And now the government seemed to want to take part of that away. Government was forcing them to teach in Russian also. And they started to worry about what other things would be restricted about their life in Russia. Here's the Russian alphabet, which the children were now expected to learn. Because of this, in the 1870s, a number of Russians left, Russia's Mennonites left. In fact, a third of all of Russia's Mennonites left. Many immigrated to Manitoba and the American Midwest. There were already a lot of Mennonites, and a large, considerable number of Mennonites in North America. They were Swiss and South German Mennonites. And areas in Canada where they lived were north of Toronto, for one. And the picture shows Altona, Ontario. There's an Altona in Manitoba, but this is the one in Ontario, and it was started by Mennonites. They built a mill there, a sawmill, and also a grain mill, and houses and so forth. There's nothing there now of the settlement except a plaque indicating where it was. So it's a sort of a Mennonite ghost town. There were also Mennonites, Swiss and South German Mennonites in the Niagara area where they were growing fruit and doing other things, and also in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. Lady Dufferin, the Canadian Governor General's wife, was quite fond of Mennonites as immigrants. She called them hardworking, honest, sober, simple, and hardy. I think that probably the Mennonites would have liked all those terms that she used, except maybe simple. Meanwhile, what's happening in Russia? The period after the mass emigration of the 1870s turned out to be a golden age for Mennonites. They couldn't have really predicted that that would happen, but it did. Russia became the breadbasket of Europe, and Mennonites were involved in that and benefited from the economic upturn. They built flour mills like the one in the picture. They built factories that made all kinds of different things, from farm machinery to furniture to bricks and so on. There was a famous clock factory called a Kroger. The clocks made there were called the Kroger clocks, and some people still have them today. They're quite prized. Some Mennonites during that period became very wealthy. They built stately homes on beautiful estates. This is an example of one, and you see the garden there all in quite a fancy pattern, and I'm sure very well kept. But the Mennonite estate owners didn't try to disconnect themselves from other Mennonites, from the less wealthy Mennonites. They kept their connections to the Mennonite villages where most Mennonites lived. This is an example of a layout of a village. You see some of the houses here and the orchards behind them, and the fields beyond, and then this main street going through the village. This is Alexanderville village, which was in the colony of Molochna in Russia, and it's shown as it was in 1874. The estate owners also attended the village churches. They kept their support of the churches, and they gave to the village charities and so forth. In the 1880s, the Russian government introduced compulsory military training for its citizens. Now, it wanted something from the Mennonites. They couldn't just be free from any of that kind of obligation. They were supposed to serve in forest camps instead, working in the forest, taking care of the forest, conservation, that kind of thing. They had the separate camps. These were run by themselves by Mennonites. They had Mennonite chaplain to guide the people who work there in spiritual ways. And so that's what they did instead of being conscripted or taking compulsory military training. Meanwhile, what's happening in Canada in the 1890s, the first Mennonite settlements began in what were to become the provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta. In Saskatchewan, they were started around Rostern, and in Alberta around Didsbury. And here we see some young Mennonites out in the field working. It was hard work. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, Mennonites started daughter colonies in several areas of Russia beyond South Russia. Before, they had been mostly in this area here, now called the Ukraine, but it was at that time called South Russia, and mostly they had stayed in that area. But now there were more and more of them, and they needed more space, especially for their younger people. So what they would do is buy up land elsewhere. Say, for example, if a nobleman or noble people of some kind were selling land, and the Mennonites would buy it, and the people would go there and start new colonies. As you can see, this is South Russia, as I said, but then there's a whole lot of Russia, other area of Russia. So they started colonies in some of those places. Just a few examples of those. In 1898, Orenburg, they started Orenburg near the south end of the Ural Mountains. In the 1900s, they started Omsk in western Siberia. 1901, Terek, north of the Caucasus Mountains. And 1910, Arkadak, west of the Volga River in Saratov province. And as far as I know, Arkadak was the last one of these. Now, in North America, again, we seem to be going back and forth between North America and Russia, but things were happening in both places, important things. In 1899, North American Mennonites began sending missionaries to India. In 1901, they began sending missionaries to China and Nigeria. What was happening politically? In the early 1900s, American and Canadian women were working hard to get the vote. That was they believed that they had a right to be able to vote just like men, and they were working hard to make that a reality. In Russia, actually, nobody could vote until Tsar Nicholas II started Russia's first parliament in 1906. There were two Mennonite representatives in that parliament called the Duma. They were Herman Bergman and Peter Schroeder. In the picture here, you see one of my grandmothers. This is Elizabeth Peters, born Peters, and her sister, Catherine. They were in Russia that time. In 1914, sadly, World War I began. This became very tricky for the Mennonites. The Russian government made life harder for them, for the Russian Mennonites, because Russia and Germany were on opposite sides. So Mennonites were seen as Germans, in effect enemies. And this is ironic because the Mennonites had clung to their Dutch language while they lived in Polish Prussia. They clung to that until just a few years before they left Prussia. Many of them left. But then they were invited in because of the German language, along with other German language groups. And so now suddenly that German language was frowned upon. And so they couldn't win one way or the other. The Russian government brought the Mennonites out of the forestry camps. And this was a big deal because in the forestry camps, they were with their own people. They could support each other, their customs and their beliefs and faith, and they had the chaplains. But now they were brought out of those and brought right into the Russian war machine, and they worked as ambulance drivers. Here's an ambulance of the time, and first aid, giving first aid. Mennonites also worked in other services in which they didn't carry arms. The Russian government stopped short of making them carry arms, and in which case they would be killing other people, and that was definitely against their beliefs. Here's a picture that we have in our family of providing medical aid. This is my great uncle Wilhelm Siemens, and here's the patient, probably a wounded soldier, and these are women who are also working on providing medical aid. Here, Mennonites in non-combatant roles in the Russian army. This is one of my grandfathers, Jacob Cornelius Martins. Marked him with a blue rectangle there. He was a blacksmith, and he did that. He worked in that capacity during the First World War, and I think he also did some work in providing medical aid. All right, we'll see you in the next episode of this YouTube series. It's called Mennonite History 6, Revolution, Emigration, and the Great Depression. While you're still here, this is my novel, Consider the Sunflowers, 299 pages. It takes place in the 1940s on the Saskatchewan prairie mostly. Some of it is Vancouver. And it's a family story, a love story, a story about community and recent immigrants and how they got along with each other, not only Mennonites, but others. And it's available online for $20 if you're interested, from the publisher, Borealis Press of Ottawa, not the American Borealis Press, but the one in Ottawa, Canada, or Chapters Indigo or Amazon. Thank you for listening.